You're listening to the Hallowed Dead on Divine Mercy Radio, 540 AM. The story you're about to hear is extraordinary, to say the least. I set out to tell a simple story about three children, Saints Francisco and Jacinta Marto, and the venerable sister Lucia dos Santos. But the deeper I went, the more I realized this story is anything but simple. To have an encounter with an angel alone is astonishing. To be entrusted with the message from the Holy Mother herself is beyond comprehension. What was it like to be the poor, faithful children at the turn of the last century, suddenly entrusted with heaven's messages? Did they understand its weight? Did they know the faithful would seek their intercession more than a century later? Did they realize the suffering that so often marks the path of saints? This is a story of obedience, of free will, of hearing God and choosing how to respond. Welcome, everyone. I'm your host, Kevin Sullivan, a medical provider by trade and an accidental journalist by circumstance. But most importantly, I'm just a layperson on my own journey with Christ. I don't speak with theological authority. I speak as an ordinary man. A man who has been greatly inspired by what I read, what I learn, and what the saints have left behind. Saints serve as archetypes of human holiness, embodying the virtues and love of Christ in their lives. They are like spiritual lighthouses, guiding us towards a deeper relationship with Jesus. By contemplating their lives and virtues, we gain inspiration and practical examples of how to live out our faith with courage, humility, and charity. Information for the episode was gathered from Sister Lucia's memoirs, canonical documentation from the Vatican, official Fatima sanctuary publications, and hagiographical works. If you're interested in hearing more about Our Lady of Fatima, send an email to thehalloweddead@divinemercyradio.org. The year was 1916, Portugal. The world was engulfed in chaos. World War I ravaged the continent. Millions would be dead by the end of the decade from war, famine, and the Spanish flu. The country was a very young republic, having overthrown its monarchy only in 1910, and still politically fragile, economically weak, and socially fractured. The working class and poor were living under the boot of the political elite. On top of all this, the country's government was fiercely anti-Catholic. The Catholic Church had long been closely aligned with the monarchy before it was overthrown to make way for the First Portuguese Republic. This made the government uneasy as clergy were considered very influential in public life. The Church was associated with royal authority. Catholicism was framed as an enemy of the Republic. The government actively portrayed Catholic belief as anti-scientific, politically dangerous, and loyal to a foreign power, the Vatican. Priests were surveilled, religious processions were banned, public devotion was ridiculed, and belief itself became suspect. It was into this world, violent, skeptical, disillusioned, that heaven itself stepped in and began to whisper, not to theologians, generals, kings, or bishops, but to three children, each with distinct personalities perfect for the message. Lucia dos Santos was 9 years old, the youngest of 7 children, in a poor hamlet of Ajustrel, just outside of Fatima. From the beginning, she was different, not quieter, but sharper. She was observant and strong-willed, a natural leader among children. She organized games, she settled disputes. When the sheep wandered, Lucia was the first to notice. She was confident, outspoken, and unusually serious for her age. Faith for Lucia was not instinctive, it was structured. She knew her prayers, she corrected others when they forgot the words. Even before the Fatima apparitions, she carried a sense of responsibility, as though the order mattered and truth needed guarding. That instinct would become a cross. Lucia's cousins, Francisco and Jacinta Marto, were younger. Francisco was 8, Jacinta only 6. Francisco was gentle, withdrawn, and contemplative. He preferred solitude, sitting quietly with the sheep, playing his reed pipe and watching the sky. He was a boy who almost never spoke unless spoken to. He was not the leader, he was not a visionary voice. He didn't argue, persuade, or explain. While other boys ran, shouted, and fought, Francisco drifted to the edges. He preferred stillness. He avoided quarrels. When teased or corrected, he didn't defend himself. He simply accepted it and moved on. Before the apparitions, Francisco was not especially religious in the ordinary sense. He struggled to memorize prayers and relied on his cousin Lucia to lead. faith for him was not structured, it was intuitive. His sister Jacinta Marto burned brightly with the energy of childhood. She was the youngest of 3, barely 7 years old when heaven interrupted her childhood. Small, bright-eyed, quick to laugh, Jacinta was known for her playfulness. She loved dancing, singing, and simple joys. She was affectionate, sensitive, and deeply attached to her brother Francisco. Before the apparitions, Jacinta was like many children of Portugal. Barefoot, lively, emotionally expressive. She cried easily, laughed easily, and felt everything deeply. Where Francisco withdrew inward, Jacinta reacted outward. That emotional openness would become the channel of her sanctity. They were ordinary children by every external measure. They herded sheep, they played games, and they argued with each other. As devout Catholics, they often prayed the rosary, but did it in a hurry, often cutting it short so they could get back to playing. When you look at the distinct personalities of these 3 children together, it becomes clear that they were uniquely suited for the task heaven was about to place before them. Heaven doesn't make mistakes, and it chose these children with perfect intention for a mission of profound importance. The spring of 1916 marked the beginning of all that was to come. The children were grazing their sheep at a place called Cabezo, a rocky hill not far from their homes. The day was clear and the work routine, almost boring. The hillside was quiet except for the gentle sound of wind sweeping across the grain. The shadows from the clouds rolled slowly across the small hilltops. The sheep trotted in lazy formations behind the children with their bells ringing, their hooves beating a path in the sod. And then, suddenly, without warning, everything just stopped. Complete and total silence. Lucia would later say that the air suddenly felt thick, pressurized, as if something unseen had entered the space and displaced the natural world as they knew it. The 3 children, startled by the apparent cessation of time and space, looked towards the sky, above a row of olive trees. Inexplicably, hovering in the air before them, was a figure. He was human in appearance, yet unmistakably not human. They described his appearance as young, not quite like a child, but not aged either. Youthful, luminous, yet restrained. His body seemed to be made of light, not shining outward, but transparent, like a crystal held up to the sun, as if light came through him rather than from him. They described his clothing as white, brighter than fresh snow, yet soft, flowing, almost alive. The children didn't scream or run away. When questioned about it years later, Lucia described the encounter this way. We felt a supernatural presence, but it didn't frighten us. It filled us with peace. This presence brought clarity, stillness, a deep interior quiet that the children had never known. As they stood transfixed before the angel, he spoke calmly, deliberately. Do not be afraid. I am the angel of peace. Pray with me. He then knelt, and without instruction beyond his own example, the children knelt too. They felt compelled, not forced, but drawn to their knees. The angel then bowed his forehead to the ground and began to recite a prayer that the children had never heard before. Slowly and reverently, he prayed. My God, I believe, I adore, I hope, and I love you. I ask pardon for those who do not believe, do not adore, do not hope, and do not love you. After hearing the prayer, the children repeated it, word for word, again and again and again. Later, Lucia would say that while they were reciting the prayer, they felt overwhelmed, not physically but interiorly, as if their bodies were still present but their souls were being stretched beyond normal limits. After the prayer, the angel rose, and he looked at them not with judgment but with something like an expectation, like this visitation was just the beginning of something bigger soon to come. Then, as quickly as he appeared, he vanished. No flash, no sound, just gone. Immediately after he left, the sounds and the movement of the countryside returned. Birds sang again, the wind stirred the leaves, and the sheep bleated. But the children sat in silence in the field for a long time. Lucia recounted that, in the aftermath, they didn't even talk about what had happened. The experience was too interior, too sacred. Words felt inadequate. For days afterwards, the children felt drawn to prayer, not as an obligation, but with a hunger. They prayed the angel's prayer over and over again, and it seemed something inside them had been awakened. One detail returns again and again in Scripture, and it always struck me as deeply revealing. Nearly every time an angel appears, the words spoken are the same. Be not afraid, which tells us something important. It tells us that the initial human reaction to an angel is not comfort, it's fear. I'm guessing it's not the same fear as danger, but the fear that comes with standing in the presence of something that does not belong in this world, and also, more importantly, something that doesn't need our permission to be here. And then in the aftermath, any doubt you ever had towards heaven turns into certainty almost instantly. Considering Sister Lucia's account, an angel doesn't feel like a friend walking in the room. It feels like the room itself no longer belongs to you. And I think that's what makes these encounters so disruptive. Because once you've seen something like that, once reality has been peeled back even for a moment, you don't get to return back to normal. The saints don't come away from these encounters thrilled or empowered. They come away changed. Most of the time they're quieter, they're more serious, and more aware that the universe is not as tame as we pretend. And maybe that's why angels always begin with the same words, "Do not be afraid." Not because there's nothing to fear, but because fear is the natural response when people look directly into eternity. We are creatures of limits. We know the world through 5 senses, through weight, sound, light. But heaven isn't of this world. It exists beyond the edges of imagination, beyond anything language can fully hold. And I'd guess that trying to explain it is like describing color to a blind man. The words fail, not because reality is small, but because it's too vast. And when the two worlds collide, as they did in Fatima, those who witness it are left grasping for language that just doesn't exist. Like the prisoners of Plato's cave, what once appeared as shadows on the wall suddenly becomes flesh and bone. And after that moment, nothing looks the same again. Months had passed since the first visitation, and soon the hot summer air settled into the hills of Fatima. Nothing at all in the landscape hinted that the children's world was about to change once again. And as they watched their sheep move about the hills, just as before, the wind stopped. There, right in front of them, the angel had returned. This time his appearance felt heavier. The children knelt without thinking, almost instinctively. They knew now that this was not a visitor to be studied or questioned. This was a messenger whose words would carry a heavy weight on their lives, and possibly on the world. The angel spoke to them of prayer, but not gently, not as comfort. He spoke as one who understood the cost at stake. And then his voice took a deeper tone, weighted down with the message of sacrificial obedience. He spoke the words that would follow them into sickness, loneliness, and even early graves. Make everything you can a sacrifice, and offer it to God as an act of reparation for the sins by which he is offended, and in supplication for the conversion of sinners. He was asking them to take the smallest, most ordinary sufferings of their lives, hunger, fatigue, loneliness, misunderstanding, and to transfer them into something deliberate, something offered, not simply to watch suffering unfold in the world, but to enter it willingly. The angel paused, letting the meaning settle, and then he added something of enormous gravity. In this way, you will draw peace upon your country. Peace for a world that had been drawn into war for years. Peace for a country that had seen revolution, had seen its monarchy overthrown, had seen the persecution of the Catholic Church. Peace not by way of armies, speeches, or political power, but through 3 young children kneeling in the dust. Children who could barely read, who owned nothing, and who would never leave their village. And yet they were being told, without exaggeration or reassurance, that the fate of souls and the suffering of nations at war were somehow bound to their response. The angel didn't ask if they understood. He didn't ask if they were willing. He simply spoke and then vanished. The silence that had surrounded the countryside lifted in an instant. The children remained kneeling long after he was gone, weak and quiet, knowing, without yet fully grasping, that their childhood had narrowed and that everything from this moment forward would carry weight. And still, to the credit of their amazing faith and strength, they accepted it, not with enthusiasm, not with pride, but with simple obedience of souls too young to calculate the cost and too honest to refuse it. Time had passed and autumn came quietly to the hills of Fatima. It was in this quieter season, when the land itself seemed to prepare for a rest, that the angel returned one final time. There was no sense of repetition now. What had begun as instruction and deepened into sacrifice was about to reach its center. The 3 children knelt and were praying the angel's prayer, the one he taught them earlier, with their faces on the ground when suddenly a bright light surrounded them. The angel appeared before them holding a chalice. Above it, suspended in the air, was a host, white and luminous, unmistakable. From it, drops of blood fell slowly, deliberately into the chalice below. This was not a gentle image. It was precise, liturgical, and unavoidable in its meaning. The children didn't need an explanation. Even without theological training, they understood instinctively this was the Eucharist, not a symbol, not as a metaphor, but as a sacrifice. The angel didn't speak at first. Instead, he left the chalice and host suspended in the air and knelt low to the ground. He bowed deeply, forehead touching the earth, modeling an adoration so complete it seemed to pull the children into it. Then he prayed, "Most Holy Trinity, Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, I adore you profoundly. I offer you the most precious body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ, present in all the tabernacles of the world, in reparation for all the outrages, sacrileges, and indifferences by which he is offended." This wasn't a prayer meant to comfort. It was a prayer meant to repair. It named a wound most people never consider, that God is not only rejected through hatred or violence, but through indifference, through neglect, through forgetting what is present before us. When the prayer ended, the angel rose, he took the host and gave it to Lucia. Then he lifted the chalice and offered the precious blood to Francisco and Jacinta. Even though Jacinta was not yet old enough to receive communion in the church, heaven made no mistakes. This was not about an age or a rule, it was about formation. And in that moment, something extraordinary was taught to them, that the Eucharist is not a reminder, but a reality, that Christ is not distant but present, and that adoration, offered freely, matters more than we even know. When it was over, the angel vanished, as quietly as he had come. He would never return. The children remained prostrate, drained of strength, unable to speak, barely able to move. They had no way of knowing what was going to come next, only that something greater was drawing near, and that they had prepared, not with comfort, but with truth. The angel hadn't spoken to them like children, he had spoken to them like soldiers. Pray with me, offer yourselves to God, make reparation for sins. These weren't gentle suggestions, they were commands, delivered without threat but with gravity, and the children felt it. For weeks, the children returned to their daily routines. They shepherded sheep, they played, they argued like siblings. In Lucia's recollection, their family soon became aware that things have changed. Jacinta, once playful, now cried during her prayers. Francisco lingered in church after Mass, refusing to leave. Lucia became more serious, guarded. When questioned, they offered no explanation, just shrugs and silence. Their parents assumed illness, imagination, or religious fervor stirred by village catechism. But the children knew better. They were waiting. This period between the angel and Our Lady was one of internal suffering. They couldn't explain why they prayed so much, why they offered sacrifices, why they spoke of sin and God's sorrow in terms no child should possess. And yet they couldn't stop. What was coming next would not be private or hidden in the hills of the countryside. It would be for the world. And when Our Lady finally appeared in May of 1917, the children were prepared, already disciplined, already stripped of illusions. They were no longer just shepherds, they were witnesses. And soon, whether they liked it or not, many would believe, but others mocked, threatened, and tested the children. And that is where our Holy Mother enters the story. May 13th, 1917 arrived, and was a day like any other. Children gathered at a place called Cova de Iria, a shallow field just outside of their village. The sheep grazed as they always had. Nothing in the pasture hinted that heaven was about to make an appearance once again. They prayed the rosary as it had been taught to them, faith received, not yet examined, words memorized long before their full weight could be fully understood. And then the order of the moment changed. Similar to when the angel made his appearance, the world quieted, as though it was making room for creation itself. Lucia would later say it felt as if time had been gathered up, not erased, but held. Then a light appeared, focused, intentional. And above the branches of a small oak tree, she stood. A lady clothed in white, radiant, with the light that didn't originate from her, but passed through her, much like the angel. She was a presence that didn't overwhelm, but still claimed every part of their attention. She appeared young, peaceful, solemn but not distant. She stood, as if heaven had gently rested her upon the earth. In her hands she held a rosary. Her face, indescribably beautiful and calm, carried a quiet seriousness, the kind that speaks of joy touched by sorrow. Then the lady spoke. Her voice was soft, not carried on the air, but placed directly into their souls. "Do not be afraid." When Lucia found the courage to ask where she was from, the answer came simply, "I am from heaven." She gave no name. Instead, she asked a question so gentle it almost concealed its weight. "Will you offer yourselves to God, to endure all the sufferings He may send you, as an act of reparation for the sins by which He is offended, and in supplication for the conversion of sinners?" Without hesitation, the 3 children answered yes. The lady smiled, sorrowful yet filled with love. She promised them God's grace would sustain them. She told them that they would suffer, but they wouldn't be abandoned. Then she asked something simple, something familiar, something that would become the backbone of the message of Fatima. Pray the rosary every day to bring peace to the world and an end to the war. This wasn't a casual request, it was an invitation to surrender. A vow of trust made by children who believed beyond what sight alone could justify. Before departing, the lady opened her hands and light poured forth. Lucia would later say it penetrated their souls so completely that they saw themselves in God, understood themselves as He sees them. They were overwhelmed, they fell to their knees, and then she withdrew. Not rising upward, but receding, as though the light itself had simply returned to heaven. The moment ended, the pasture returned, the sheep grazed, and the sky remained blue, but nothing was the same. The children stood in silence. Lucia understood one thing immediately. This couldn't remain a secret. The lady asked them to return on the 13th of each month for 6 months. Heaven had spoken, and it was not finished. At home, the ordinary world pressed in immediately. There were chores to be done, supper to be prepared, questions asked and answered without patience. When Jacinta could no longer contain herself and spoke of the lady, the reaction was not awe, it was disbelief. Her mother scolded her sharply. Stories like this were dangerous, especially for children. Lucia's own mother reacted harshly. She suspected exaggeration or imagination, or even worse, deception. Lucia insisted, and that was her mistake. Her mother pressed her, questioned her, demanded details, but the more Lucia spoke, the more convinced her mother became that something was wrong. No one in the family had ever spoken of visions. God didn't work this way, especially not with children. News traveled fast. Neighbors mocked her openly. Some laughed. Others warned that the children were inviting trouble, attention from the authorities, or worse, from the church. Children taunted them in the streets, and some adults demanded proof. Others accused them of lying for attention. The children had been promised suffering, and it had begun sooner than they expected. Yet despite the doubt, despite the anger, despite the isolation, none of the 3 ever denied what they had seen. They didn't argue, they didn't defend themselves, they waited. Because heaven had asked them to return, and so they would. Okay, I'm gonna have to be honest with you. If you came up to me and said 3 young children had an encounter with an angel, I probably wouldn't believe them. I wrestle with that idea because it feels like you're doubting heaven. How can you listen to stories like this without a sense of skepticism? Apparitions, visions, miracles, children claiming heaven opened the sky and spoke to them. It's natural to pause, to wonder, and to question. Skepticism in these matters is not a failure of faith. The Catholic Church doesn't ask us to accept apparitions as doctrine. Fatima is not the creed. Lourdes is not the gospel. Even approved apparitions are never binding on the conscience. They're called private revelation, not because they're secret or unimportant, but because they're not necessary for salvation. Public revelation ended with the apostles. Nothing, no vision, no miracle, adds to what Christ has already given. So if you listen to these stories and find yourself hesitating, you're not doubting heaven. You're doing exactly what the Church herself does, listening carefully. But still, there's a tension there, because these stories don't feel abstract, they feel close and intimate. And when something carries beauty, moral clarity, and spiritual weight, doubting it can feel like rejecting God Himself. But that's a confusion we don't need to carry. To question whether heaven spoke in a particular place is not to deny heaven exists. You can decline an invitation without rejecting the host. The Church has always approached claims like this with restraint, not asking whether they inspire, but whether they bear fruit. Do they contradict the faith? Do they foster humility, obedience, repentance, love of Christ? Or do they feed spectacle, pride, and obsession? Even when an apparition is approved, the Church says only this: nothing here contradicts the faith. It may be believed prudently, not you must believe. And lastly, there's a difference between skepticism and cynicism. Skeptics say, I don't know yet, but a cynic says, this must be false. Faith has room for the first, but it struggles under the second. Even in the Gospels, after the resurrection, some doubted, and Christ didn't condemn them. He met them where they stood. So how should we listen to stories like Fatima? Not with a blind disbelief, not with contempt, but with openness and freedom. Ask not, did this happen exactly as described, but what fruit does it bear? Does it draw souls to Christ? Does it deepen prayer, repentance, charity? Does it humble or does it entertain? If it bears fruit, receive it. If it does not, set it aside without fear. Faith doesn't rest on apparitions. It rests on Christ, crucified and risen. And perhaps that's why Fatima endures. Because even if every miracle were stripped away from the story, its message would still sound unmistakably Christian. Pray, repent, love, intercede, and hope. So if you listen with questions in your heart, you're not faithless, you're human. Truth doesn't fear examination, heaven isn't fragile, and God isn't threatened by your honesty. He has always met his people, not in certainty alone, but in trust, and sometimes in the courage to keep listening. Over the next several months, June, July, September, the lady appeared again and again. Each apparition brought deeper revelations. June 13th, 1917, the Feast of St. Anthony. By the time the children returned to the Cova de la Ria, they were no longer alone. Word had spread, quietly at first, then with urgency. Curiosity drew people from nearby villages, farmers, laborers, mothers carrying infants, skeptics standing with folded arms. They gathered beneath the open sky, waiting for something they weren't sure they even believed. Lucia, Francisco, and Jacinta arrived just as they had been instructed. They knelt, they prayed the rosary, and once again, the world shifted. Above the small oak tree, the lady stood. The crowd saw nothing. They heard nothing. But many sensed something, an unexplainable stillness, a sudden silence pressing down upon the field. The children saw her clearly. As before, she was clothed in white, radiant with a light that didn't cast shadows. The rosary rested in her hand, and her presence was calm, maternal, and immeasurably serious. She asked them to continue praying the rosary every single day. She reminded them that sacrifice would be required and that God's plans would unfold slowly, not according to human expectation. Then Lucia made a request of her own. She asked that Francisco and Jacinta be taken to heaven soon. The lady's response was gentle but firm. Yes, she said, I will take them soon. But Lucia was told she would remain, she would stay longer, and she would suffer more, because God was entrusting something to her. Then the lady revealed what would become the heart of her message. She opened her hands. From them flowed a light, not outwardly toward the world, but inward toward the children. Lucia would later say it penetrated their souls so deeply that they understood without words what was going to be shown to them. Within that light, they saw hearts surrounded by thorns, pierced not once but repeatedly by the sins of humanity. This was her immaculate heart, a heart that loved without reserve, a heart wounded by indifference, a heart asking not for admiration but for reparation. The lady spoke again. She said that God wished to establish devotion to her immaculate heart in the world, not apart from Christ but alongside him. Just as the Sacred Heart of Jesus reveals divine love poured out for humanity, her Immaculate Heart reveals the human response God desires: obedience, humility, and total surrender. She didn't ask for novelty, she asked for fidelity. Prayer, conversion, daily recitation of the Rosary, turning away from sin, not out of fear but out of love. When the lady departed, the light withdrew gently, like a door closing without sound. Some said they saw the leaves of the oak bend downward, as if pressed by an unforeseen force. Others noticed a sudden cooling of the air. Many felt unsettled but couldn't say why. The children stood in silence. They had seen the heart of a mother, and they understood even then that the path ahead would demand everything. I was taken aback by Lucia's request for Our Lady to take her cousins to heaven. Why was she asking for their early deaths? I had to dig into this a little deeper. After the May apparition, heaven was no longer abstract to Lucia. Mary had said, "I am from heaven." For a 10-year-old girl, that changes the map of reality. Heaven is no longer later or someday. It was real, immediate, and beautiful. Lucia understood instinctively what the saints articulate later. Heaven is the goal, not life itself. So when she asked for Francisco and Jacinta to go to heaven soon, she wasn't wishing loss. She was wishing completion. To Lucia, it would have sounded like, let them finish the race. Lucia already sensed suffering was coming and wanted to spare them. Mary had spoken of sacrifice, the angel had spoken of reparation, and Lucia was beginning to grasp that obedience to heaven would cost something. She likely sensed, without being able to explain it, that the burden would fall more heavily on her, and that her cousins, especially Jacinta, would suffer deeply. As a child, her instinct was protective. If heaven is real and suffering is coming, let them be safe there. This is the instinct of an older sibling. So she asked a question a child would ask: can they go home now? And Mary's answer gently corrected her understanding. Yes, for Francisco and Jacinta, but you will remain longer. This wasn't punishment, this was an assignment. Mary's response reveals heaven's logic, not human sentimentality. Mary doesn't scold Lucia. She doesn't rebuke her. She answers calmly and truthfully. Francisco and Jacinta would go soon because their mission would be short, hidden, and intense. But Lucia would remain because her mission required memory, articulation, endurance, and decades of fidelity. Love sometimes asks questions before it understands answers, and heaven is not something that saints cling to. It's something they serve towards. Lucia didn't yet know what it would cost her to remain, but Mary did. And still, Lucia stayed. July 13th, 1917, the vision. By July, the crowd was no longer curious, it was expectant. Thousands gathered at the Cova de Iria. The air was heavy with heat and anticipation. Some prayed, others watched. Many people simply came to see what would happen to the 3 children who refused to recant. Lucia, Francisco, and Jacinta arrived as they always did. They knelt, they began the rosary, and once again, the order of the world bent. The light appeared, and above the small oak tree, the lady stood. Her expression this time was described as grave, as though what she was about to reveal carried consequences beyond words. The lady spoke of sacrifice, of prayer, of the rosary prayed daily for peace and the end of the war. She spoke of suffering not as a threat but as reality. Then she said, "You have seen hell, where the souls of poor sinners go." And with that she opened her hands. What followed lasted only a moment, but it marked the children for the rest of their lives. The earth seemed to vanish beneath them. They saw a vast sea of fire. Souls, human souls, were immersed within it, transparent and blackened, tossed about like embers in a furnace. Cries filled the space, sounds of despair, hatred, regret without repentance. Demons moved among the souls, grotesque and terrifying, yet clearly distinct from the damned. The horror didn't come from imagination, it came from recognition. This wasn't a metaphor, this was a consequence. Jacinta screamed. The children instinctively raised their eyes to the lady, because had she not promised to take them to heaven, they believed that they would have died of terror. The vision ended and the field returned and the sky remained blue, but the children were no longer the same. The lady spoke again. She said that God wished to establish devotion to her immaculate heart to save souls from this fate, that many souls were lost because no one prayed or sacrificed for them. Then came the warning. The war would end, but a worse one would come if humanity did not cease offending God. Errors would spread, nations would rise against nation, the Holy Father would suffer. And yet, this was not a message of despair, it was a plea. If my requests are heeded, she said, Russia will be converted and there will be peace. If not, suffering, martyrdom, a world wounded by its refusal to return to God. And then she left them with a promise that something would be given later, something so great that all would believe. The children rose from their knees, the crowd surged forward, but Lucia said nothing, Francisco said nothing, and Jacinta wept uncontrollably. That night, Jacinta couldn't eat, she couldn't sleep. From that day forward, hell was not an idea for her, it was a reality she carried in her heart, and her life became a single response to what she had seen. She would offer every pain, every hunger, every illness for sinners. Francisco became even more quiet, drawn inward, focused on consoling God, whom he now understood to be deeply offended by sin. Lucia understood something else. This was no longer about them, it was about the world. And heaven had entrusted the children with a message meant for all of humanity. By August, Fatima was no longer a private matter. The crowds had grown too large, the message too disruptive, and the children too dangerous to ignore. Civil authorities, openly anti-clerical and hostile to the church, decided it was time to intervene. So on August 13th, the children never reached the Cova de Iria. They were intercepted. Lucia, Francisco, and Jacinta were taken from their homes under false pretenses, separated from their families, and transported to the town of Vilanova de Orem. They were told that they were being taken in for questioning. Instead, they were imprisoned. For the first time since the apparitions began, the children were placed behind locked doors, treated not as visionaries but as threats. They were interrogated, pressured, threatened. Lucia was told to reveal the lady's secrets or face consequences. When she refused, the threats escalated. They were told that they would be boiled alive, that they would be killed one by one, that no one could save them. Jacinta cried, Francisco prayed silently, but Lucia stood firm. She later wrote that this was the first time she truly believed that they might die, and yet none of them recanted. After several days, the interrogations failed. Public pressure had mounted and the crowds at Fatima continued to grow. Eventually, the authorities relented and the children were released on August 15th and returned to their families. Because of their detention, the lady didn't appear on the 13th of that month. Instead, she came to them later, on August 19th, at Villinhaus, a quiet place near the children's homes. They were tending sheep again, the same light appeared, and she stood before them. Her expression was sorrowful. She spoke of the suffering that awaited them. She spoke of sacrifices God would accept, and she spoke of the ongoing need for prayer, for the rosary prayed daily, for peace, for sinners. Pray very much, she said. Make sacrifices for sinners. She told them that many souls were lost because no one was willing to suffer or pray for them. She also revealed something else, that in October, a miracle would be granted so that all might believe. She didn't condemn the authorities, and she didn't speak of revenge. She spoke only of endurance, of faithfulness under pressure, and of truth spoken softly but lived courageously. She then departed. The children stood in silence. They had been imprisoned, threatened with death, humiliated by adults, and heaven had not spared them, it had trusted them. August became the turning point. From this moment forward, the children understood that belief would cost them everything, and they accepted it. Not because they were fearless, but because they had already seen what happens when the world forgets God, and they refused to let that be the final word. October 13th, 1917, the miracle of the sun. It rained, not lightly, but relentlessly. Cold rain soaked the fields, turning Cova da Iria into a basin of mud. An estimated 70,000 people stood packed together beneath a gray and oppressive sky. Some prayed aloud, some mocked, and some just waited in a tense silence. Lucia asked the crowd to close their umbrellas. They knelt in the mud, they began the rosary, and at noon Lucia cried out that she is coming. The rain immediately stopped and the clouds began to part, and the lady appeared above an oak tree, brighter than ever. She identified herself at last. I am the Lady of the Rosary. She asked that a chapel be built in her honor. She repeated the call to pray the rosary every day. She warned that the war would soon end, but people must stop offending God. Then she looked sorrowful at the world below, and she vanished. Lucia then cried out, "Look at the sun." What followed defies any easy language. Thousands would attest that the sun changed its appearance into a dull silver disk, clear enough to be stared at without pain. It began to spin, casting bands of blue, yellow, purple, red across the sky and the earth below. The crowd screamed. Some fell to their knees, others wept, some cried out for mercy, convinced the end had come. Then, even more amazingly, the sun seemed to break free from the sky. It plunged down towards the earth, zigzagging, violent, immense. People threw themselves into the mud, confessions were shouted aloud. Even the atheists prayed. And just as suddenly, the sun returned to its place. The clouds closed and the rain ceased. Strangely, the ground, soaked moments before, was suddenly dry. Clothes were dry, hair was dry, the mud was gone. The crowd stood in silence, stunned. No one laughed, no one mocked. The miracle had been seen as far as 40 kilometers away. It was printed in secular newspapers. It was observed by those who had come to disprove it. For the children, the miracle was not a climax, it was a confirmation of something they had already believed. What mattered now was what came next. The lady had spoken, the world had been warned, and heaven had bent the laws of nature, not to terrify but to call humanity back before it was too late. The message of Fatima was complete. After the October miracle of the sun, the crowds dispersed. The newspapers printed their accounts. The sky returned to its ordinary silence, but the children didn't return to ordinary lives. Instead, the real trial began. The children were examined again and again, asked to repeat their story, defend their memory, justify what could not be justified by reason alone. Lucia endured scrutiny the longest. She was accused of invention, of pride, of manipulation. Adults spoke over her and corrected her recollections. They demanded certainty from a child whose entire life had been interrupted by heaven. She would later write that this period tested her faith more than the apparitions themselves, not because she doubted what she had seen, but because she was asked to carry it alone. Francisco withdrew into silence. He spent long hours praying before the parish church, focused not on the fear of hell, but consoling God, whom he now believed was deeply offended by sin and forgotten by all of humanity. He spoke very little, and his interior life grew immense. Jacinta changed the most visibly. The vision of hell had burned itself into her soul. She began offering every inconvenience, hunger, thirst, ridicule, illness, for sinners she would never meet. She would refuse small comforts. She prayed constantly, and she spoke often of the Holy Father, whom she believed would suffer greatly. Then sickness came. First it was Francisco. During this time, the influenza pandemic swept through the entire world, sparing no small village, especially in Portugal. Unfortunately, Francisco weakened rapidly. He accepted his suffering quietly, asking only to receive Holy Communion one final time. He died in 1919. Jacinta followed soon after. Her illness was prolonged and severe. Tuberculosis, surgery without anesthesia, long isolation in hospitals far from home. But she suffered without complaint, and she offered everything, as she always had. She died in 1920, alone, except for God. Lucia remained. She buried both her cousins, and she also buried her childhood, and she carried the message forward. Her path wasn't dramatic, it was obedient. She entered religious life, she wrote when commanded, and she remained silent when ordered. She lived long enough to see wars come and go, to see Fatima recognized by the church, and to see popes kneel where she once knelt as a child. She lived long enough to understand what she had been asked to do. Francisco and Jacinta had been spared by time. Lucia had been given it, not as a gift, but as a responsibility. Fatima didn't end in October of 1917. It unfolded quietly, painfully, faithfully across decades. The children had not changed the world by force. They changed it by surrender, and that, perhaps, is the most unsettling miracle of all. At its heart, Fatima is a call to prayer and conversion, a request repeated with quiet urgency. Pray the rosary every day, offer sacrifice, allow even suffering to become intercession. This is not extraordinary spirituality reserved just for saints. It's the ordinary rhythm of Christian discipleship, prayer, repentance, love offered on the behalf of others. The message spoken to the three children in the field was, in truth, addressed to a wounded world, one torn by war, divided by sin, and forgetful of God. At Fatima, heaven didn't offer new doctrine. It offered proximity. The Immaculate Heart of Mary stands at the center of this message, not as an abstraction, but as a living reality. A heart that knows sorrow, a heart that grieves for lost souls, a heart that intercedes with maternal persistence. Fatima also reminds us that heaven isn't distant. God still breaks into human history. He still interrupts routine, and he still knocks. The apparitions, the miracle, the suffering that followed, each one declares the same truth. The supernatural is not a relic of the past. Eternity still presses against time, and when it does, it demands a response. And finally, Fatima reveals the cost of holiness. Sanctity doesn't always arrive crowned in glory. Sometimes it arrives as an illness, in ridicule, in early graves and unanswered questions. Francisco, Jacinta, and Lucia were not spared suffering because they were chosen. They were chosen and therefore asked to endure. Fatima teaches us that holiness is often hidden in fragile bodies and bruised hearts, that faith may demand more than comfort, and that love, true love, always costs something. The message of Fatima doesn't end in 1917, it just waits for anyone willing to listen. As decade after decade passed, the little chapel, Capellinea, built on the very spot where the apparitions first occurred, grew quietly at first, then steadily, and into a global shrine. Pilgrims came in increasing numbers, drawn not by spectacle, but by something they couldn't name, a sense of heaven brushing against earth. In 1930, the local bishop declared the apparitions worthy of belief. That simple recognition gave the faithful permission to embrace what the children had seen, heard, and lived. In 2017, exactly 100 years after the first vision, Pope Francis made a visit to Fatima. He canonized Francisco and Jacinta, welcoming millions of pilgrims who still walk the winding paths, pray the rosary, weep, and hope. Heaven isn't trapped in dusty pages or locked inside ancient cathedrals. God knocks, he visits, he whispers, and sometimes he comes to the least, the smallest, the most humble among us. At Fatima, 3 children saw with eyes of faith. They prayed simple prayers, they trusted even as the world laughed. Their courage reminds us of something timeless. Faith doesn't depend on age, it depends on trust, on surrender, and on love. So whatever you believe, however far you may wander, perhaps light a candle, whisper a prayer, or simply listen. Listen for his voice. Maybe he's waiting to meet you too. Thank you all very much for listening to the Hallowed Dead on Divine Mercy Radio 540 AM. If you missed any part of the program, episodes are available on demand at divinemercyradio.org. Click listen and then local programs. Wherever you're struggling, remember, others have walked this road before you. Let the saints remind you that perseverance can become glory. Good night.